The night the divorce papers came through, I sat on the floor of my new apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes that still smelled like storage dust and failure. The radiator clanked like it was mocking me, and the only sound after that was the hum of traffic outside. My name is Ethan Cole, and at 40 I had managed to lose my wife, my job, my house, and most of the dignity I thought I still had left. Sarah took everything that had color, the furniture, the Subaru, even the damn dog. The landlord had just painted the walls eggshell white, and the smell of fresh paint mixed with burnt coffee made the place feel temporary. Like I was only renting time here. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't have to look to know who it was, but I did anyway. A message from Sarah. Hope you're enjoying your bachelor pad. Richard just moved his new piano into your old music room. It cost more than you made in 5 years. I stared at the words until they blurred. Another text came right after. They're turning your office into a wine lounge. Richard deserves it. You never did. I laughed once. Short and bitter. The kind of laugh that hurts more than it helps. I wanted to throw the phone but stopped myself. There was nothing left to break that mattered. On the other side of the room sat the one thing she hadn't touched. A small steel safe that used to belong to my grandfather, Eugene. It had followed me through every move of my life. And no one had ever opened it. Not my parents. Not me. I'd always thought it was just another relic from a man who used to tell tall tales about serving in the Air Force. The old man died when I was 12. And all I remembered was the way he hummed while tuning his violin. My mother said he was just a clerk who played music for the officers. Nothing more. That night, maybe out of boredom or anger, I dragged the safe into the middle of the room. The metal groaned across the hardwood. It was heavy. Scarred. The dial rusted in spots. I had a small audio frequency scanner from my last contract job at Lockwood Systems. Back when I still fixed classified comm equipment for defense labs, I figured maybe I could use resonance to catch the tumblers. It felt stupid, but it gave me something to do. I hooked the mic up, turned the knob slowly, listening for changes in pitch. The clicks came faint at first, like whispers. After 10 minutes, something inside shifted. A dull metallic clack echoed through the apartment. I froze. When I pulled the handle, it moved. The door creaked open. A puff of dry air spilling out. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, yellowed papers, and a flash drive wrapped in wax paper that smelled like time itself. A single line written on the cover of the notebook read, Operation Trident, classified 1971. I sat there, pulse racing, thinking it was probably some music notation or code he'd made up for fun. But the word Trident hit something familiar. Lockwood once had a contract with a missile communication program called the same thing. Maybe it was coincidence. I reached for the flash drive, felt the weight of it, the cold of the metal casing. It was labeled in fading ink, Trident. That was when I heard it. A knock. Sharp. Precise. 3 times. I stood. Hesitated. It was almost midnight. I went to the peephole. 2 men in dark suits stood in the hallway. No badges. No smiles. One held a small folder. I cracked the door just an inch. Can I help you? The taller one spoke first. Calm but firm. Mr. Cole. We're with the neighborhood safety inspection. We had a report of a possible chemical leak in the building. I blinked. Chemical leak, I don't think so. I haven't even unpacked bleach. He smiled without warmth. Mind if we check the ventilation? Won't take long. Something about the way he said ventilation made my stomach twist. The shorter man's eyes darted toward the safe behind me. My instinct screamed, not tonight. I said, you can come back with a notice. They exchanged a glance. The kind of silent conversation trained people have. The taller one nodded once. Polite again. Of course. Mr. Cole. We'll return tomorrow. Be safe. The words sounded like a warning. When I closed the door, I heard one of them speak quietly through the door. But the words didn't reach me. Their footsteps faded down the hall. I stood there a long time, listening, waiting. Then, I moved to the window. A black SUV was parked by the curb. Engine running, The same two silhouettes climbed in and drove off without lights for the first block. I sat back down on the floor, the open safe beside me, that flash drive heavy in my hand. Trident. Classified 1971. My heart pounded like it wanted to be anywhere but my chest. I thought of the stories my mother used to tell. About how Grandpa Eugene came back from the war quiet. How he burned all his letters before he died. How she once caught him staring at the radio for hours after hearing a song. I looked at the notebook again. The handwriting was neat. Deliberate. Inside were pages of sheet music. But the notes didn't make sense. They weren't songs. They were patterns. Numbers hidden in rhythm. Repeated measures that looked like a code. The air felt heavier. Maybe it was the radiator still hissing or the faint smell of metal and oil from the safe. Maybe it was something else. Something older. I glanced at the door again, half expecting another knock. Nothing. Just silence. I turned back to the first page of the notebook. In small pencil at the bottom were words that didn't look like his usual handwriting. For E. C. When silence becomes power. Play the truth. I sat there, staring at it. The city noise humming through the window. Whatever this was, it wasn't just music. The flash drive gleamed under the lamplight. My thumb brushed over the label again. Trident. I didn't know what I was holding, but somewhere deep in my chest. The same cold certainty my grandfather must have felt settled in. Something had just started, and I had no idea how to stop it. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by the sound of tires cutting through slush. I turned off the light, sat in the dark, and waited for the silence to tell me what came next. Morning crept in through the blinds. Thin gray light cutting across the floor like a warning. I hadn't slept. The flash drive sat on the table next to my half-empty coffee mug. The label Trident, staring back at me like an accusation. The words in my grandfather's notebook looped in my head until they felt carved there. When silence becomes power. Play the truth. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe the two men last night were building inspectors. Maybe the flash drive was junk, but part of me knew better. The safe had been locked for 6 decades and someone still came knocking the same night. I opened it. That wasn't coincidence. By 8, I'd showered, dressed, and was staring at my phone like it might answer questions on its own. I thought about calling the police. But what would I even say? 2 men in suits scared me after I opened a box full of sheet music. They'd pat me on the head and tell me to get some sleep. Then the phone rang. No number. Just private line. My stomach tightened. I hesitated. Then picked up. Mr. 5. Cole. The voice said, "This is Colonel James Whitman, United States Department of Defense. Please stay calm and listen carefully." I froze. The voice was controlled. Older. Confident. The kind of tone that doesn't ask for attention. It takes it. "Who is this really?" I asked. "I just told you," he said. "Your grandfather, Eugene Cole, worked for an operation under my department in the early 70s. He was attached to a classified weapons program called Operation Trident. That program is no longer active. But the materials in your possession are still property of the United States government." I glanced at the flash drive. My throat went dry. That safe was sealed for over 60 years. I said, "You telling me this is government business now?" "Yes. And more importantly, it's family business." I didn't know what to say. He continued. Lower now. As if the phone line wasn't as secure as he wanted it to be. "Your grandfather was not a clerk, Mr. Cole. He was a cryptographic officer working on the Trident nuclear launch authentication system. His job was to create safeguards to prevent unauthorized use. In 1974, he vanished along with a section of encrypted data. That data is what you're holding." I felt lightheaded. My grandfather, the quiet man who used to hum and build radios in the basement, was a cryptographer who stole nuclear secrets. Why call me? I finally managed. Because his files stated one condition for contact: the day his descendant unlocks the safe. That made the room tilt. "Mr. Cole," the colonel said, "you need to bring that drive to Washington immediately. There's a ticket waiting for you at O'Hare under your name. Flight leaves at 11:30. We'll meet at the Pentagon Visitor Center at 3. Do not share this with anyone. Wait, I said. How do I know this isn't a scam? Because if you don't show up, the Federal Recovery Division will seize your property by force, and you'll spend the next decade explaining national security violations to people who don't believe in coincidence. The line went dead. I stood there staring at the phone until it went black again. Then I laughed. Short and sharp. The whole thing felt insane. I told myself not to go, but another part of me, the part that had been humiliated and dismissed for years, whispered that maybe there was something here that mattered, something that could make me more than the loser everyone said I was. I threw some clothes into a backpack, wrapped the flash drive in an old t-shirt, and grabbed my grandfather's notebook. By 10, I was in a cab headed to O'Hare. The airport was half empty. Rain misting the glass. Security waved me through faster than usual. I caught myself scanning faces, half expecting to see the 2 men from last night. When I boarded, seat 2 amperes. The flight attendant greeted me by name before I said anything. That didn't help the nerves. During takeoff, Chicago's skyline blurred into the clouds. I tried to read the notebook again, tracing the pattern of notes. But all I saw were numbers disguised as rhythm. My grandfather wasn't writing music. He was writing code. 3 hours later, Washington spread out under a hard white sky. At baggage claim, a man in a dark uniform stood holding a sign with my name on it. No smile. No small talk. I followed him to a black SUV parked outside. The ride into the city was quiet. The driver didn't answer when I asked where we were going. Through the window, marble buildings slid past, monuments that looked older than truth itself. I saw the Pentagon rise in the distance, its gray walls sharp against the cold light. Inside, after 3 security checks and a metal detector, I was led into a small conference room. The air smelled like disinfectant and old paper. A flag stood in the corner, the colors dulled by fluorescent light. A few minutes later, the door opened. A tall man in his 50s entered, uniform pressed, short gray hair, sharp eyes. Colonel Whitman. His handshake was quick, firm, as if measuring me. Mr. Cole, thank you for coming. Please. Sit. He placed a folder on the table. Inside was a black and white photo of my grandfather in uniform, sitting at a piano in what looked like a bunker, handwritten underneath Operation Trident, Fort Severn Naval Facility, Maryland. That was him. No question. The same calm eyes I remembered watching me practice scales as a kid. Your grandfather was part of a team that built encryption safeguards for the Trident missile system, Whitman said. But he wasn't just a coder. He developed something called harmonic cryptography, hiding data inside sound frequencies. I stared at him. You're saying he hid nuclear codes inside music? Whitman nodded once. Every song he wrote could carry a message, coordinates, access keys, identification strings. When the program ended, 32 files went missing. Officially, they were destroyed. Unofficially, they were buried. And you think he buried them in a safe that's been sitting in my family's house for 50 years? Not think. No. We found his final report last year when parts of the Trident archive were declassified. He predicted his descendant would unlock the safe when the time was right. Why me? I said quietly. Whitman studied me. Because you're an audio engineer? You understand frequency the way he did. He believed blood carries patterns. Mr. Cole. That someday you'd hear what others can't. The words didn't feel real. I leaned back in the chair. This is insane. The colonel's expression didn't change. Maybe. But if you choose not to help, the material goes into federal custody. If it falls into the wrong hands, we risk the same chain of corruption that cost your grandfather his life. I felt my throat tighten. He didn't die of cancer. Did he? Whitman looked down. He was declared deceased in 1995. That's all I can tell you. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a plane ticket and a military visitor badge with my name already printed. Beneath it, in faint pencil, a note in handwriting that didn't belong to Whitman. Fort Severn, Maryland. Silence hums loudest at the shore. When I looked up, Whitman was watching me like a man who already knew what I would decide. You don't have to believe me yet, he said. Just don't lose that drive. We'll talk again when you're ready to hear what your grandfather really did. The meeting ended there. Outside, the winter wind hit like a slap. The driver from earlier waited by the curb. The same expressionless face. The same silent SUV. I climbed in and pressed my forehead against the cold window as the city blurred past. My head buzzed with everything Whitman had said. Operation Trident. Harmonic cryptography. Buried data. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. But somewhere in my gut, I knew this was just the first page of a story that had been waiting half a century to be read. When the SUV turned onto the highway toward Maryland, I looked down at the envelope again. The words were barely visible in pencil. But they were his. My grandfather's handwriting. The same curve of the letters. The same rhythm of his old notes. Silence hums loudest at the shore. Whatever waited there. It was calling me now. The drive felt endless. Miles of frozen road, cutting through gray farmland, until the sign started reading Anne Arundel County. The sky hung low, heavy with snow that never fell. I kept glancing at the folder on the seat next to me. The photograph of my grandfather like a ghost staring back. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the words again. Silence hums loudest at the shore. The driver finally spoke for the first time since leaving Washington. We're here. Fort Severn Naval Facility. Decommissioned in '98. Restricted perimeter. But Colonel Whitman cleared your entry. The SUV stopped by a rusted gate. Beyond it stretched rows of abandoned buildings, their roofs sagging under years of rain. The air smelled like metal and old water. I stepped out and the cold hit sharp. The guard shack was empty, except for a single keypad and a security camera hanging sideways. The driver handed me a badge. Swipe this and follow the path to Building 12. Someone's waiting. When I swiped the badge, the gate groaned open like it hadn't been used in years. My boots crunched over the gravel as I walked down a narrow road lined with cracked lampposts. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that watches you. Building 12 loomed ahead. The words Research Unit faintly visible on the wall. The door gave after one shove. Inside, dust floated through pale light from a broken skylight. Desks, overturned chairs, and a few control panels sat frozen in time. I ran my fingers over one of the consoles. My reflection stared back in the dark glass. Older than I remembered. A voice startled me. You shouldn't be here alone. I turned fast. A woman stood by the door, holding a flashlight, late 40s. Short brown hair streaked gray, wearing a faded doe jacket. She looked at my badge, then at me. You must be Ethan. I'm Linda Morales. I remembered the name from Whitman's notes. Former Department of Energy analyst. She walked closer, studying me like she was measuring what kind of trouble I might bring. Whitman said you'd contact me. I said. She snorted. Whitman says a lot of things. Usually the part that keeps him out of trouble. She took the notebook from my hand and flipped through it. When she reached the page of strange sheet music, her face changed. I haven't seen this pattern in decades. Harmonic sequencing. Your grandfather was ahead of his time. You knew him. I worked under him when I was a graduate intern. She said quietly. He wasn't just writing codes. He was building a fail-safe. He believed music could protect humanity from itself. She pointed at a string of notes. This repetition here. See, that's not melody. It's location encoding. It's coordinates. She grabbed a marker and wrote the translation on the wall. Senshurba. Jotensi by Senshurse. Tishaleo. Sityamba by Senshur. Fort Severn. She whispered. I stared at her. We're already here. Not exactly. That's under the facility. The old reactor tunnel system. They sealed it in '98 after a coolant breach. She looked at me again. You have the flash drive. I pulled it from my pocket. The light from her flashlight caught the word, Trident. Linda nodded. That's the key. These drives weren't just storage. They were encryption activators. Plug that into the mainframe down there. And if it still has power, you might wake up a system that hasn't been touched in half a century. And that's a good idea. She smiled without humor. Depends who's listening. We moved deeper into the building. The power was long gone. So we used our phone flashlights. Linda found a hatch under a collapsed desk. A rusted ladder disappeared into the dark. You sure about this? I asked. No. But curiosity beats fear every time, she said, and started down. The air below was colder, dense with the smell of oil and decay. The tunnel was lined with pipes, some dripping condensation. We followed them until the passage opened into a chamber with a control console half covered in dust. The metal plaque above it read, "Reactor Control Access Vault." Linda brushed the panel. The console flickered. Weak but alive. Backup batteries still working. She turned to me. "Plug it in." My hand shook a little as I slid the flash drive into the port. The screen lit up. The words, "Access Code Required" blinking. Linda flipped through the notebook, her finger tracing one pattern after another. Try E major. Measure 7. Second line. I adjusted the frequency dial on the panel to match the notes. The console beeped, then flashed green. A low rumble echoed somewhere behind the wall. A small door slid open, revealing a metallic box the size of a shoebox. The engraving on top read TRD 447. Linda exhaled. "Your grandfather hid a vault inside a reactor." I'll be damned. I lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. When I wiped away the dust, the lid released with a hiss. Inside was another drive. This one older, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. "If you are reading this," it said, "you carry the blood of silence and the burden of truth. Operation Trident was never shut down. Do not trust those who claim it was. The enemy wears the flag." Linda's flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. "He knew," she whispered. Before I could ask, a metallic clang echoed from above. Footsteps. Loud. Deliberate. We froze. The sound of boots moved closer, descending the ladder we'd used. Linda grabbed my arm. "We need to move. Now." She led me through a side passage that opened into another tunnel. Behind us, flashlights swept across the chamber. Voices followed. One of them called out, "Find them. The colonel wants the drives intact. Ashcroft Defense." "Linda," he said. I recognized the logo on their vests. We ran, our lights bouncing off wet concrete. Ahead, a faint blue glow hinted at an exit sign, barely hanging from the ceiling. We burst through a rusted door into the open air behind the facility. The cold hit hard. Linda pressed against the wall, breathing fast. "They'll sweep the area. We need to get off this property before they call in drones." I stared at her, heart pounding. "You think Whitman sent them?" She met my eyes. "Either that or he's working with them." I wanted to believe that wasn't true. But the memory of Whitman's calm face in that office felt different now. We crossed a frozen ditch and climbed up the embankment toward the tree line. The night was quiet again except for the crunch of ice under our boots. In the distance, the faint rumble of an engine started up. When we reached the edge of the woods, Linda turned to me. "Your grandfather wasn't paranoid, Ethan. He was protecting something. And whatever it was, people are still willing to kill for it." I looked back at the base. The faint lights of flashlights moved like insects below. I could almost hear my grandfather's violin in the wind. Soft. Ghostly. Linda handed me the metallic box. "Keep it safe. Don't trust anyone until we know what's inside." I nodded, still catching my breath. "What now?" "We find out what the hell Trident really was," she said. "Then we decide if the world deserves to know." We started walking through the dark woods toward the highway, the cold biting harder with every step. The box heavy in my hands like it carried every secret my family had ever buried. The motel Linda found was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and everything smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarettes. We didn't talk much on the drive there. The box sat between us on the seat like a sleeping animal. Neither of us wanted to wake. Every few minutes, I caught her glancing in the rearview mirror, checking for headlights. When we finally parked, she cut the engine and sat still for a long time, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "They'll search the base by morning," she said quietly. "If we're lucky, they'll think we escaped empty-handed." I carried the metal box inside. The room was small, the carpet threadbare, the air heavy with damp air freshener. I set the box on the table and sank onto the bed. Linda locked the door and slid the chain across. For a moment, the silence felt thick enough to breathe. "We need to see what's inside," I said. "Not yet." She pulled her phone from her pocket and started typing fast. We need backup. Someone who can verify what we're looking at before we open it. Who do you trust for that? I asked. She looked up. Her expression grim. Nobody. But I know someone who hates Ashcroft more than he fears them. She made a call. I only heard fragments. Daniel. It's Morales. Yeah. I'm alive. No. Not by much. I need you in Baltimore by morning. Bring your camera and your clearance contacts. When she hung up, she caught my stare. Investigative journalist, she said. We used to work together on a defense audit. Got me fired. Saved my conscience. I leaned forward, the edge of exhaustion turning everything a little unreal. You think this is going to end with a newspaper headline? She smiled faintly. If we're lucky. It ends with the truth. The hum of the old air conditioner filled the room. I took the folded note from the box again and read it for the 10th time. The enemy wears the flag. My grandfather had written that, and I couldn't stop hearing it. You knew him better than anyone. I said, did you ever see signs he was hiding something like this? Linda took off her jacket, rubbing her temples. He was the kind of man who believed secrets were a burden, not a weapon. The last time I saw him, he told me that silence can protect or destroy, depending on who holds it. Then he left without saying goodbye. I nodded slowly. My mother always said he died in a veteran's home. Quiet and kind. She never knew the rest. That's how they wanted it. Linda said, clean endings. No questions. At some point, we both dozed off. The lamp still on, and the box untouched. I woke around dawn to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I went to the window and saw a sedan idling across the lot. Lights off. A man sat inside, face hidden by the glare of his phone screen. Linda was up in seconds when I whispered her name. She took one look and grabbed her bag. Time to go. We slipped out the back exit. The cold air biting. Her car started without headlights, the engine barely audible. As we pulled onto the highway, I looked back. The sedan's lights flashed on and followed. They're tailing us, I said. No kidding. She muttered. Hold on. She turned off at the next exit. Weaving through a maze of industrial warehouses, the sedan followed, keeping distance. At the fourth turn, she slammed the brakes, cutting the lights. We sat in the dark, the only sound our breathing. The sedan rolled past, slow, unsure. When it turned the corner, she reversed into an alley. We waited another 5 minutes before she spoke again. Either Ashcroft has full surveillance on this, or someone inside Whitman's office sold us out. I stared at the horizon where the sedan had vanished. Whitman's words echoed back. Don't lose that drive. By the time we reached the diner outside Annapolis, the sun had climbed above the rooftops. Daniel was already there. A tall man in a frayed coat, camera bag slung over one shoulder. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Linda made the introductions quickly. Daniel shook my hand, eyes sharp. You're the musician, he said. The one who opened the safe. Guess that's my legacy now, I replied. He pulled out a recorder. Mind if I document this? Linda glared. Not a word leaves that device unless I approve it. He nodded, then leaned in as I opened the notebook on the table. When he saw the musical code, his eyes widened. This is military cryptography disguised as composition. I've seen fragments of this before in declassified archives. Your grandfather might have been sitting on the only uncorrupted data from Trident. I showed him the note. The one warning about the flag. Daniel's jaw tightened. That line showed up in testimony from whistleblowers who tried to expose Ashcroft in the 70s. They vanished before trial. Linda stirred her coffee. Figures. Daniel lowered his voice. If this box has proof that Ashcroft used government contracts to launder or weaponize classified systems, they'll do more than follow you. They'll erase you. I looked at Linda. Then we make sure they can't. Daniel handed me a small USB splitter. Plug this between the flash drive and any computer. It'll copy everything to a secure cloud the moment it boots. Even if they find us, they can't bury the truth completely. We drove to an old public library on the edge of town. The Wi-Fi was slow, the lights flickering, but it was quiet. Linda set up her laptop, connected the splitter, and took a breath before inserting the drive. The The screen flashed, then filled with lines of code. Daniel's recorder clicked on. Files unfolded like pages from another century. Documents marked top secret. Blueprints. Memos. Communications logs. At the bottom of one folder, a digital document titled Operation Trident Contingency. Linda opened it. The first line read, "If the system falls into corporate hands, initiate silence protocol." The next line was a list of names: politicians, executives, defense contractors, and near the bottom, Whitman. Linda swore under her breath. He's on the list. The realization hit hard. The colonel hadn't been helping us. He'd been managing us. Daniel took photos of the screen, his hands shaking. "This is bigger than any of us," he said. A loud crack shattered the moment. The front window exploded inward. Glass rained across the floor. Linda shouted, "Down." I dropped behind the desk as another shot punched through the wall. Daniel scrambled for cover, clutching the recorder. Linda pulled a small pistol from her bag and aimed toward the door. Outside, tires screeched. A black SUV blocked the entrance. Men in tactical gear poured out. Masks on. "Back door," I yelled. We ran through the staff hallway, boots slipping on linoleum. A bullet hit the door frame beside my head. Linda fired twice over her shoulder, then kicked open the emergency exit. Cold air hit as we burst into the alley. Daniel stumbled but kept running. Another SUV roared to life nearby. Linda tossed me the keys. "Drive." We dove into her car. I started the engine and floored it. Gravel spraying. Bullets cracked against the bumper as we sped out of the lot. The rear window shattered. Daniel ducked low, pressing the recorder against his chest. "You got the files uploaded?" I shouted. "Almost." "Signal dropped mid-transfer," he said. Panicked. "It's halfway there." Linda leaned forward, scanning the mirror. "They're not shooting to scare. They're shooting to end it." I gripped the wheel tighter. "Then we make sure they fail." The highway opened ahead. The city falling behind us. The sound of gunfire fading into the wind. For a moment, no one spoke. The adrenaline bled out, leaving only the pounding in my ears. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The black SUV was gone. Daniel exhaled. "Jesus Christ." Linda checked her gun, then looked at me. "You wanted to know what your grandfather was hiding. Now you do." I didn't answer. My hands were shaking too much to trust my voice. Outside, the sun sank low, painting the horizon the color of rust. We had the evidence, the enemies, and nowhere left to run. When the first sign for Washington appeared ahead, Linda said quietly, "We're not going back to Whitman. We're going to someone who still believes in oversight." "Who's that?" I asked. "An old judge who owes me a favor," she said. "But if she helps us, we'll be burning every bridge left." I nodded, then light the match. The drive back into the city felt longer than it should have. The air had that heavy stillness before a storm, the kind that makes the radio static sound louder. Linda sat beside me, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Daniel was in the back seat with his camera bag in his lap like it was a shield. No one said much. The car still carried the smell of burned rubber and gunpowder. When we finally hit the outskirts of D.C., Linda told me to take the exit for Georgetown. "The judge lives on the edge of Rock Creek," she said. "She retired 10 years ago, but she still knows where the bodies are buried." The neighborhood looked like another world. Brick townhouses, iron fences, lights glowing warm behind thick curtains. Linda directed me to an old stone building half covered in ivy. She told us to stay put, then disappeared up the steps. Daniel leaned forward, whispering, "You trust her." I watched her silhouette ring the doorbell. "I don't trust anyone right now." The door opened. A tall woman in her 70s stood there. White hair in a loose bun, robe over a dark dress. She looked like the kind of person who could silence a courtroom with a raised eyebrow. After a short exchange, Linda motioned us to come inside. The judge's name was Margaret Halley. The living room was lined with shelves of legal books, a fireplace burning low, and a piano in the corner. I couldn't look at it without thinking of my grandfather. Halley studied us from behind a pair of thin glasses. "You brought trouble into my house," she said to Linda. "Trouble brought itself," Linda replied. We just brought proof. Hallie's eyes flicked to me. And you are? Ethan Cole. Ma'am. Eugene Cole's grandson. The name seemed to hit her. She sat down slowly. I knew your grandfather. He testified before me in '75 under sealed court. I thought he was dead. He is, I said quietly. But he left something behind. Linda opened the laptop and pulled up the decrypted files. Hallie leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the names and signatures. When she reached Whitman's, her expression hardened. I always wondered why that man's promotions came faster than his cases. Daniel chimed in from his corner. We have more. Video logs. Communications between Ashcroft executives and military officers. Some of them still active. Hallie looked at him. You're recording this, aren't you? He smiled nervously. Old habits. Turn it off. If this room is compromised, we're already dead. He obeyed. Hallie stood, pacing slowly in front of the fire. Operation Trident was buried under national security privilege. It gave defense contractors free rein to experiment with deterrence systems off the books. Billions vanished. Your grandfather's report accused them of falsifying nuclear inventory data. He disappeared 2 weeks later, so he was right. I said. She nodded. He wasn't a thief. He was the man who stopped one. Linda closed the laptop. Then we need to make sure the world knows that. Hallie turned sharply. Not yet. You have one chance to do this right. If you go public now, they'll bury it under redactions and indictments. You need a trigger, something undeniable. Daniel frowned. Like what? Evidence that ties modern corruption to the old operation. You said you found a secondary drive. Didn't you? I nodded. It's still sealed. Hallie tapped the table. That's your trigger. But if you open it, you open a door that can't be closed. Outside, thunder rolled. The storm had finally arrived. Rain hit the windows in steady rhythm. Linda met my eyes. We're already through the door. Hallie sighed, then disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she carried an old briefcase. Inside was a portable decryption module. I used this back when we seized evidence from Fort Knox in the '90s. She said, if there's anything on that drive, it'll talk to this. I set the second drive in place. The module blinked to life. Green, and then amber. Lines of text scrolled across the small screen. For a long time, nothing made sense. Then the pattern stabilized into a single folder name. Project Chimera. Linda leaned closer. I've heard that codename. It was a prototype weaponization study. Hallie adjusted her glasses. Read the subheading. Daniel whispered it out loud. Integration of bio-audio encryption into autonomous deterrence systems. I frowned. Bio-audio encryption. Linda's voice was tight. They were embedding cryptographic signatures into living tissue, using sound frequencies as activation keys. That means Trident wasn't just about missiles. It was about control. Hallie looked like she'd swallowed glass. Jesus. They built a system that could turn humans into coded weapons. Before I could process it, the lights flickered, then went out. The room plunged into darkness. Outside, the rain turned into sheets. Daniel cursed quietly. Linda grabbed her gun. They cut the power. I heard tires screeching on the street. Headlights swept across the window. A voice outside barked orders. Hallie whispered. Downstairs. There's a service tunnel. Move. We scrambled after her through the kitchen, down a narrow set of stairs that led into a storage cellar. She hit a panel on the wall, and part of the shelving unit slid aside, revealing a concrete tunnel. She looked back at me. Once we're inside, keep that drive safe no matter what happens. If I don't make it, you go to Harris. He's with the Bureau. Tell him it's Chimera. We followed her through the tunnel as footsteps pounded above us. The air smelled of dust and mold. Linda stayed behind me, gun raised, her flashlight cutting thin circles of light ahead. The tunnel led to a metal grate that opened onto the riverbank behind the house. The Potomac shimmered under flashes of lightning. Daniel climbed out first, then helped Hallie and Linda. I was last, clutching the drive and the box. Behind us, glass shattered. Flashlights swept the basement windows. Voices shouted. Hallie pointed toward a parked boat half hidden under a tarp. Go. That's mine. We ran, the rain turning to ice on our faces. I could hear gunfire behind us. Muffled but close. Linda fired back once. Just enough to buy time. We jumped onto the boat. Daniel cutting the ropes with a knife from his pocket. I started the motor. It sputtered, puffed, then roared to life. As we pulled away from the dock, two figures appeared on the shore. Weapons raised. Bullets hit the water beside us, sending small eruptions of spray. Linda grabbed my shoulder. Keep going. Don't stop. The current took us fast. The city lights fading behind. Rain blurred everything into streaks of gray and white. I looked down at the drive, glowing faintly in my hand. The word chimera pulsing like a heartbeat. Hallie sat in the back, soaked but composed. You have no idea what you're holding, she said. I didn't answer. My grandfather's voice was already whispering somewhere in the back of my head, faint like music under static. The truth wasn't finished yet. The river bent east, the storm chasing us down the black water. And for the first time I wondered if surviving the night would actually be the easy part. The storm followed us downriver like it had a grudge. Wind clawed at the boat, and the waves slammed against the hull hard enough to make my teeth ache. Linda was at the bow, her hair plastered to her face, scanning the dark water for debris. Daniel crouched beside the console, keeping the camera bag clutched to his chest as if it could stop bullets. Judge Hallie sat behind me, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding her phone close to the glow of the navigation light. She said the signal's weak, but I can get a message to someone. She called over the wind. Harris. Right, the agent who owes your grandfather's ghost a favor? Linda shouted back. Send him coordinates. Tell him Chimera's live again. Hallie typed fast, her fingers steady despite the chaos. When she finished, she turned off the phone and dropped it into her coat pocket. If they tracked it, it won't lead them far, she said. I looked toward the skyline behind us. Somewhere back there, men with government clearance and private contracts were watching our dots on a map disappear into the dark. I didn't know which scared me more, that they might find us, or that they already knew where we were going. We reached the far bend of the river an hour later, the rain softening into mist. The motor coughed once and died. Linda swore under her breath. She tried the ignition twice, but it was flooded. We drifted toward a patch of reeds along the bank. Daniel pointed. There's a boathouse up ahead. Maybe we can hide there until daylight. We guided the boat in silence until it scraped against the dock. The place looked abandoned. Just an old wooden shack with peeling paint and a collapsed roof on one side. Inside, it smelled of oil and damp wood. We tied the boat and slipped inside. Hallie wrung out her coat and sat on an overturned crate. Linda wiped rain from her gun with a rag she found. Daniel paced, restless, the recorder already back in his hand. You think Harris will come? He asked. Hallie gave a small, humorless laugh. If he's still the man I knew, he'll show up with half the bureau and a Bible full of NDAs. I sat near the wall, the drive still in my pocket. Its glow was faint, but I could feel the weight of it like heat against my leg. I pulled out my grandfather's notebook, flipping through the pages again. The last entry wasn't music. It was a series of phrases, handwritten in pencil. Silence is the weapon. The code must sleep in sound. I traced the words with my thumb. He'd left these for me, or maybe for himself. But either way, it felt like a warning. Linda crouched beside me. What is it? He used sound as encryption, I said. Every melody, every code. If Chimera was built on that, maybe it's still listening. Her eyes narrowed. You think the drive can respond to frequencies? I nodded slowly. Or trigger something. Daniel stopped pacing, like a kill switch. Linda shot him a look. Or something worse. The door rattled suddenly. We all froze. Hallie whispered, "Light off." The room went dark. Footsteps creaked outside. Slow and deliberate. I could see the faint beam of a flashlight cutting through the cracks in the wall. Linda raised her gun. Daniel held his breath. Then a voice outside called out, "FBI. Don't shoot." Linda hesitated, eyes flicking to Hallie. She nodded once and moved to the door. When she opened it, Agent Harris stood there in a rain-soaked trench coat. Two men behind him. His face looked carved from fatigue. "You people really know how to start a fire," he said. Linda didn't lower her gun until he raised both hands. "You got my message?" Hallie said. "Barely. Your phone was flagged 3 times by Defense Intelligence before I intercepted the signal." He stepped inside, shaking the rain off. His gaze landed on me. "Ethan, you still have the drive." I nodded. He motioned toward it. "Let me see." I hesitated. But Linda shook her head. "Not yet. You tell us first if Whitman's involved." Harris's jaw tightened. "Whitman's gone. Disappeared from the Pentagon yesterday afternoon. Security footage shows him leaving with 2 men from Ashcroft Defense. After that, nothing." Hallie muttered something under her breath. "Then it's worse than I thought." Harris looked at her sharply. "You knew about Chimera, didn't you?" She met his gaze. "I suspected. I just didn't know how deep the rot went." Harris ran a hand through his hair. "The Bureau's trying to contain this. But if Ashcroft activates whatever's left of Trident's code, they'll have leverage over the entire defense grid. Your grandfather built a system designed to fail safe. If someone reverses it, they could turn it into a control matrix." I stood up, the words hitting me harder than the cold. "You're saying they could use sound to trigger real weapons?" Harris nodded grimly. "Or disable them. Maybe even target systems tied to civilian infrastructure. Power. Water. Communications." Linda looked at me. "And that's why your grandfather hid it." I took the drive from my pocket, the light pulsing faintly in the dark. What if he also built a way to shut it down? Hallie straightened. "He would have. Eugene Cole never wrote a code he couldn't end." I opened the notebook again, flipping to the last few lines. Beneath the faded words, I noticed faint pencil marks forming a pattern I hadn't seen before. I tilted it toward the flashlight. It wasn't writing. It was musical notation. Simple, but deliberate. A melody. Linda leaned over my shoulder. "You can play that." "Right." I nodded, my throat tight. Haley pointed toward the corner, where a dusty upright piano sat half covered by a tarp. "You think that's just coincidence?" she said softly. I walked toward it, heart pounding. The keys were yellowed, a few chipped. But when I pressed the first note, it sounded clear. The others watched in silence as I played. The melody was slow, haunting, rising and falling like a breath caught between grief and resolve. At the final chord, the drive in my pocket began to hum, a faint vibration running through my hand. The screen on Harris's tablet lit up on its own, showing lines of code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. He stared. "What the hell is it doing?" Hallie leaned closer. "It's decrypting. The music is the key." When the code stopped, a single line appeared on the screen. "Location confirmed. Echo Facility. Maryland." Linda exhaled. "That's where your grandfather started it." Harris looked at me. "If we go there, it's federal property. You'll be crossing into classified ground." I looked down at the piano keys. My grandfather had led me this far, note by note. I wasn't stopping now. Hallie stood, straightening her coat. "Then we move tonight, before Whitman gets there first." Harris gave a bitter smile. "You realize we're walking into a nest of armed contractors with more money than morality." Linda holstered her gun. "Welcome to America." We packed in silence. Daniel slipped his camera back into his bag. The storm had eased outside, but the air still felt electric, like the world was holding its breath. As we climbed into Harris's SUV, I looked back at the boathouse. The piano sat in the shadows, keys still glinting faintly. For the first time, I thought maybe my grandfather wasn't just leaving clues. Maybe he was giving me permission. The drive pulsed once in my hand as if it agreed. Then the light faded, and the night swallowed us whole. The highway to Maryland stretched out like a scar through the night. Harris drove fast but steady, his face hard in the dim glow of the dashboard. Linda sat in the passenger seat, watching the GPS while Daniel dozed against the window, the camera strap still around his neck. Hallie was beside me in the back, quiet but alert, her fingers wrapped around a thermos she hadn't opened. The air inside the car felt thick with things none of us wanted to say. Every few miles, headlights appeared behind us, lingered, then vanished again. Harris noticed it too. He checked the rearview mirror one more time before muttering that we weren't alone. Linda leaned closer. "How sure are you?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. Sure enough that if I stop this car, we're dead. The GPS beeped as we turned off the interstate onto a narrow road lined with bare trees. The wind had dropped. But the silence outside carried its own weight. We passed an old fence with rusted signs that read, "Federal Property Restricted Access." Harris slowed and cut the headlights. "Echo facilities just ahead," he said. The place was officially shut down in 1982. Unofficially. It was used for storage by defense subcontractors until about 5 years ago. Daniel rubbed his eyes and sat up. "You're saying there's a good chance they're already inside?" Harris nodded. "Or waiting for us." The road ended at a cracked security gate. The guard booth stood empty. Its glass shattered. A line of power poles ran into the distance, wires drooping like cobwebs. Harris parked behind a collapsed truck and killed the engine. We moved on foot from there. My boots sank into the mud as we crossed what used to be a loading yard. The buildings were hulking shapes in the dark, gray and silent. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and stopped. Linda motioned toward a concrete stairwell that disappeared underground. "That's the old maintenance level," she whispered. "If the system's still active, it'll be down there." We descended carefully, flashlights low. The walls were damp, covered in moss and faded hazard signs. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some still humming faintly. The deeper we went, the colder it got. At the bottom of the stairs was a steel door marked Reactor Control Access. Harris swiped a universal card, and the light blinked green. The door creaked open, releasing air that smelled like rust and ozone. Inside, rows of inactive servers lined the walls, blinking occasionally as if dreaming. In the center stood a console that looked older than anything else in the room. Its monitor glowed faint blue. "Waiting." Hallie stepped forward and placed the secondary drive on the panel. "Let's see what you left behind." Eugene. When she connected it, the console came alive. Code flooded the screen in rhythmic pulses, like it was breathing. Linda frowned. "That's not standard encryption. It's tonal." I recognized it immediately. The same pattern from my grandfather's notebook. I took a breath, walked over to the small speaker on the console, and started humming softly, matching the pitch. The code reacted, changing color from blue to gold. Daniel stared. "Are you telling me this machine responds to sound?" "It responds to the right sound," I said. The hum deepened into a vibration that filled the floor beneath our feet. A low mechanical groan echoed through the walls as hidden locks disengaged. A section of the far wall slid open, revealing another chamber lined with crates. Harris's gun was already in his hand. "Everyone stay sharp." We stepped inside. There were 12 metal containers, each stenciled with the same mark, TRD 447. One of them had been pried open, its lid bent. Inside, not gold, not weapons, but hard drives sealed in transparent casings. Linda knelt to inspect one. Trident cores. These held prototype keys. If Ashcroft has been duplicating them, they could override every defense network in the country. Hallie exhaled slowly. "And if we destroy them?" Harris shook his head. "Without proof, we're just vandals." Daniel raised his camera. "Proof is my department." The words had barely left his mouth when a metallic click echoed behind us. A voice said, "Stop where you are." Whitman stepped out from the shadows, flanked by 2 men in tactical vests. His uniform was gone, replaced with a dark coat. His face looked older, sharper, but his eyes were steady. "I told you not to lose the drive, Ethan," he said calmly. "You did well bringing it to me." Linda lifted her gun. "You're working with Ashcroft." He smiled faintly. "Working with no. I'm leading what's left of it. You think this country runs on ideals. It runs on deterrence. Trident wasn't a weapon. It was control. Your grandfather built something that could keep order without firing a single shot. You killed him." I said. His eyes softened for just a second. "He chose silence over chaos. Don't make the same mistake. Hand me the drive, and you walk away alive." Harris took a step forward, gun raised. "You're under arrest for treason and conspiracy against the United States." Whitman laughed. "You think you have jurisdiction here? Look around. This isn't government ground anymore." The men beside him aimed their rifles. The air went still. Linda whispered without turning her head. I count 2 exits. Both behind him. Hallie's voice was low but steady. Ethan. Play the sequence. I looked at her. Confused. She nodded toward the console. You remember the pattern. Finish it. Whitman's gaze flicked toward me. Don't you dare. I moved fast. The first note rang out sharp against the metal walls. Whitman shouted for his men to fire. The next sound drowned everything. A deep harmonic pulse burst through the room, vibrating the floor. The servers came alive. Lights strobing. The crates began to hum. A resonance building like the start of an earthquake. Whitman stumbled, clutching his ears. What did you do? I didn't stop. The melody ran itself. Instinct guiding my hands. Each tone triggered another sequence. The same one hidden in my grandfather's journal. The resonance grew unbearable. Shaking dust from the ceiling, Harris grabbed Hallie and Daniel, dragging them toward the door. Linda stayed, covering me. The hum shifted into a roar. Frequencies overlapping. The air smelled like ozone and static. Then the lights cut out. Silence hit so suddenly, it felt like gravity failed. When my hearing came back, I was on the floor. Smoke curled from the console. The crates were silent. Whitman was gone. The room was half collapsed. One wall caved in. Linda knelt beside me, eyes wide. You alive? I nodded weakly. Where's Harris? She pointed toward the corridor. They made it out. We need to move before this place caves in. I grabbed the drive from the melted console. It was still warm, still glowing faintly. We ran. The sound of metal groaning behind us. The hallway shook as we reached the stairs. By the time we reached the surface, dawn had broken. The facility behind us was smoking, the main building sinking under its own weight. Hallie stood beside the SUV, face pale. Harris leaned against the hood, bleeding from a cut above his eye. Daniel was filming the wreckage, his hands shaking. Linda looked back at the rising smoke. What now? I held up the drive, its light dimming in my palm. Whatever that was, it shut itself down. My grandfather didn't just build a weapon, he built a conscience. Harris watched the smoke drift toward the horizon. Let's hope it's on our side. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of that last note through the trees. It sounded almost like a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. By the time we reached the city again, the morning news had already broken the story. Satellite footage showed the collapse of a decommissioned federal site near Chesapeake Bay, followed by a brief but measurable electromagnetic surge across the eastern grid. The anchors called it an infrastructure malfunction. Harris called it a miracle. We spent the day hiding in a bureau safe house outside Baltimore. A concrete apartment with no windows and a fridge full of bottled water. No one said much. Hallie had a concussion but refused to rest. Linda paced the narrow hallway, phone in hand, checking every update from the investigation. Daniel sat by the table, editing footage from the facility, his camera now carrying more truth than any courtroom. By afternoon, Harris got the call. He listened for a while, said nothing, and then hung up. His face looked like someone who had seen history blink. They found Whitman, he said quietly. Linda froze. Dead. Harris nodded. Body washed up near the mouth of the river. Gunshot wound. No sign of the men with him. I didn't know what to feel. Relief didn't fit. It was just emptiness. The kind that comes when the story's too heavy to carry any further. Hallie looked up from her notes. Then, it's over. No. Harris said, it's not. He explained that the Bureau had secured what remained of the facility and recovered partial data from the destroyed servers. The files proved the existence of Operation Chimera and linked several Ashcroft executives to classified weapons laundering contracts. Within hours, indictments were filed. Daniel's phone buzzed. He read the message, then looked up with something between shock and disbelief. It's public, he said. Every outlet has it. Someone leaked the Chimera files. Hallie gave him a sharp look. Who? Daniel shook his head. Doesn't say. The upload was anonymous. Linda smiled faintly. Sounds like your grandfather got the last word. I reached into my pocket. The drive was still there. Cold now. Its glow long gone. I didn't know if it still worked, or if it had burned itself out doing what it was made for. Either way, I didn't care. Harris said the government would move fast to contain the fallout, that hearings would follow and names would be cleared. He looked at me when he said it. And I understood. A week later, they invited me to Washington. The Pentagon's hallways looked brighter than I remembered. Cameras lined the lobby. Harris met me at the entrance and handed me a sealed folder. Inside was a single page from a declassified report. It read, Eugene Cole acted in the preservation of national security assets, and in doing so prevented the unlawful transfer of strategic defense technology. Official commendation granted posthumously. My grandfather's name finally sat where it belonged. The press conference that followed was short. Harris spoke first. Careful and composed. The kind of man who carried too much truth behind his badge. When they asked him about Ashcroft, he said justice was a process, not an event. Then he stepped aside and motioned for me. I wasn't a politician or a soldier. I was just a man with a violin and a story that refused to stay buried. So I told it plain. I told them about Eugene Cole, the man everyone mistook for a clerk, who spent his life building music that could protect a world too deaf to listen. I told them how he hid the truth in sound because he knew words could be twisted. But notes never lie. And I told them that silence isn't peace when it's forced. It's just another kind of war. When I finished, the room was quiet. Cameras clicked. But nobody spoke. For the first time, I didn't feel small in that silence. I felt seen. After the conference, Linda found me outside on the steps. Her hair pulled back. Her suit wrinkled from days without sleep. She smiled, the tired kind of smile people give when they know a chapter's closing. He'd be proud. She said. He left it to me. I said, all of it. She nodded. Then make it count. Daniel's article ran the next morning. Front page. Nationwide. The headline read, The Man Who Turned Silence into Justice. It told the story the right way. No names were sensationalized. No cheap heroics. Just the truth. Hallie retired for good after that. She sent me a letter a month later. Typed and short. It said, I spent my life in courtrooms searching for a clean verdict. Your grandfather gave me one. The Bureau eventually returned my grandfather's violin. They found it in the ruins of the facility. Remarkably untouched. The wood had darkened. But when I drew the bow across the strings, the sound came out clear. He had built it to last. Like everything else. A year passed. Ashcroft executives went to prison. And Congress quietly funded a foundation under the name Cole Initiative, dedicated to transparency in defense technology. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't need it. Instead, I opened a small studio near Chicago. Nothing fancy. Just a place where veterans and their families could come record music. Talk. Or just listen. Some nights, when the city gets too quiet, I play the old melody that started it all. The notes still hum with that strange power. Like they remember what silence used to mean. People ask if I ever think about the gold or the secrets or what my grandfather really intended. I tell them I stopped wondering. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you keep others from destroying. The last time I visited his grave, I brought the violin. The wind was light. The grass trimmed neat. And the world felt almost honest for once. I played the song slowly, letting it drift across the headstones. The final note hung in the air longer than it should have. Soft and steady. It felt like he was still listening. If you've made it this far, maybe you understand something about the kind of silence that changes a man. Maybe you've carried your own version of it. Heavy and waiting to be heard. Tell me what stayed with you most. Tell me if you've ever found truth where you weren't supposed to. And if you want to hear more stories about how justice sometimes hides in the quiet, stick around. There's always another note waiting to be played.